Prince William had prepared himself for many things in the year ahead: public criticism, private family strain, the familiar cycle of palace stories that surface, dominate a news cycle, and then settle into the background noise of public life. What he had not prepared for was the sealed parliamentary summary that arrived on his desk at Windsor. 3 royal decree entries, altered signatures, authorization dates rewritten after the fact, seal logs that refused to match the surrounding paperwork. Every one of them traced to the private office of Queen Camilla. He read the document once, then he read it again. Those present in the room later described how he simply stopped moving. The matter was no longer a family disagreement or an administrative oversight. Someone had entered the machinery that carries the sovereign's authority and changed what it recorded. The weight of that discovery settled over the study like a physical presence. William had lived through enough palace turbulence to recognize the difference between a manageable scandal and something that reached into the foundations of the institution itself. This reached deeper. William placed the summary on the desk and kept his hand flat upon the cover. Catherine stood nearby and watched the gesture. She later said that single action told her the contents were grave. The review had examined royal orders across the preceding year and isolated 3 decrees linked to Camilla's household. Each carried disputed dates, questionable approval lines, and seal records that did not correspond to the documents they accompanied. A royal decree is not an internal memorandum. It is a formal instrument that assumes the personal and knowing consent of the king. These 3 had already produced practical consequences: access to private collections, ceremonial permissions, and household appointments. Catherine asked the question that had hung between them since the folder opened. She asked whether Charles knew. William did not answer at once. He was already picturing his father reading the same pages and discovering his wife's office attached to authority that may never have been granted. The silence that followed was not empty. It was filled with the knowledge of how much Charles had invested in that marriage and how carefully he had protected it against every external pressure for decades. Consider what Charles had invested in that marriage. Decades of sustained public pressure. Years spent reconstructing a reputation before a country that had resisted her presence. He had placed more trust in Camilla than in almost any other living person, and he had done so openly. If that trust fractured over altered paperwork, the damage would not remain confined to one office. William turned to the annex. The altered entries had not appeared on a single night. They were distributed across several months. A solitary error can be explained by haste or fatigue. A pattern sustained over time indicates calculation. Someone had retained access, employed it repeatedly, and judged that the records would never be compared against one another. That realization changed the character of the entire file. What might have been dismissed as bureaucratic carelessness now carried the marks of deliberate design. William felt the shift in his own understanding as clearly as if a door had closed behind him. One of the 3 disturbed him more sharply than the others. It had been logged on an evening when Charles was demonstrably elsewhere, attending a separate engagement with his own staff and a clear diary record of his movements. Yet the authorization line claimed personal sovereign approval on that same night. William closed the folder with enough force to break the quiet of the room. He pushed his chair back and spoke 4 words to his wife. "Father cannot hear this alone." Catherine rose at once. Before either reached the door, a message arrived from the king's household. Camilla had already been informed of the review's findings and had requested a private meeting with Charles. The conversation William intended to begin had already started without him. The question was no longer confined to what the records contained. It had become a question of what those records had been intended to secure. The timing of Camilla's request was not lost on him. She had moved quickly, and the closed door that now stood between him and his father altered the entire shape of the afternoon. Behind every named document stood a person, and by that afternoon each of them faced a profound loss. William confronted a crisis capable of shaping the character of a reign that had not yet begun. Charles faced the possibility that trust within his marriage had been turned against the institution he had spent a lifetime preparing to defend. Camilla faced the potential collapse of an acceptance she had constructed across decades of sustained hostility. Catherine understood, before anyone spoke the thought aloud, that no one in the family would leave the matter untouched. William carried 2 obligations that pulled in opposite directions. As heir, he was expected to safeguard the stability of an institution he might one day lead. As a son, he already saw the injury the file would inflict upon his father. The conflict was no longer procedural. It was loyalty colliding with duty, and there was no comfortable space between the 2. Every decision from that point forward would be measured against both standards, and neither could be fully satisfied without cost to the other. A few rooms distant, Charles sat with the same brief. He removed his glasses glasses, set them carefully beside the file, and asked whether William had received the complete version. He did not raise his voice. The restraint itself unsettled those present. Charles had spent his adult life preparing systems to meet external attack, press campaigns, political pressure, biography, scandal. This threat had arisen inside the household he trusted most. When informed that his son had seen everything, the king closed his eyes and remained silent. Elsewhere in the building, Camilla refused every prepared line her staff offered. She wanted only Charles. The longer he delayed, the more her frustration hardened. When an aide asked whether William should be contacted, she answered simply, no. Then she asked how long the king had been sitting alone. The question revealed more than she intended. It showed that she already understood the conversation would not be easy, and that the silence from the king's rooms was itself a form of judgment. Catherine discovered in the supporting papers a detail the summary had not highlighted. One of the disputed decrees concerned access to objects linked to Diana's historical collection. She chose her moment and her wording with care. William stared at the page and said nothing. Until that point, he had treated the matter as constitutional. Items connected to his mother were never mere inventory. They carried memory, unresolved grief, and a history the family had never fully settled. Those who work near him understand that this is the subject where professional distance dissolves. The introduction of Diana's name into the file transformed the crisis from an institutional problem into something far more personal. William had spent years learning to separate his private grief from public duty. That separation was now under direct pressure. Into that silence walked Princess Anne. In a private account prepared for the review, Anne told her nephew that she had questioned one of the decrees at the time it first appeared, months before Parliament examined the records. The wording had struck her as wrong the moment she read it. Charles, she said, does not authorize matters in that language. She repeated the observation twice so that William could not miss its force. She had identified the irregularity long before the formal inquiry, and someone had caused her objection to vanish from the record. When Charles finally entered the room where Camilla waited, he did not approach her. He placed the parliamentary file on the table between them and asked directly why her office appeared in it. In the pause that followed, Anne's earlier warning assumed its full weight. The answer did not begin with the documents on that table. It began months earlier, on a specific night at Windsor, with a piece of paper that arrived after a private reception. That night had been allowed to pass into the ordinary friction of family life. Only later did its true significance become clear. A late authorization reached Windsor after a quiet reception concerned with the care and ceremonial use of historic royal objects. The language transferred temporary control over selected collection decisions to Camilla's household office. Anne read it and objected at once. Charles was absent. William had neither seen nor been informed of the document, yet the paperwork claimed sovereign approval. At the time, the disagreement followed the familiar path of such matters inside the family: a closed-door exchange, a corridor conversation, and then silence. Only later did those present understand that the moment had been the true beginning. Anne remained the most senior family member still in the building. She read the approval line twice, aides close enough to observe, and placed a finger beneath the sovereign authorization. She would endorse nothing until Charles confirmed the instruction to her personally. The aides later described the firmness of her tone. There was no anger in it, only the certainty of someone who had spent a lifetime reading her brother's language and recognizing when it did not sound like him. Anne's objection was not rooted in personal dislike. It rested on 70 years of reading documents that carried her brother's authority. The wording was too broad, too convenient, and conferred upon a single household office a discretion that removed any further need to consult the king. If the authorization was false, someone had borrowed the sovereign's authority while he was out of the building. Camilla confronted her later that night. She described the change as administrative and suggested Anne was converting routine management into a question of personal trust. Anne did not yield. According to a documented account, the two women stood facing each other after midnight when Anne spoke a single sentence: "If Charles approved this, let him tell me himself." Camilla remained silent for several seconds, then left the room without answering. That silence remained with everyone present. The matter might have ended there as one more unresolved friction, except for what the records later revealed. The absence of an answer became, in retrospect, its own form of evidence. Parliament recovered the finalized internal log from that night. Anne's objection was absent, not softened, not summarized, not footnoted, simply gone. In its place stood the statement that the decree had been received without challenge. A missing objection can be an error. A positive statement describing an event that never occurred is something else. Investigators then located a backup registry. Its timestamp showed the entry had been modified approximately 40 minutes after Anne's objection was first recorded. Someone inside the building, with Anne's complaint still visible in the system, rewrote the official record of the evening while those who had lived it remained awake. Access at that level requires senior authorization held by only a handful of people. The trail led directly to Camilla's senior office. What had once looked like family friction now stood as evidence that a night had been rewritten. The 40-minute window became the single most decisive piece of technical evidence in the entire inquiry. It transformed suspicion into a documented sequence of deliberate action. William chose the course almost no one in the family ever takes. He arranged a private conversation with no advisors, no lawyers, and no witnesses. Camilla entered the drawing room at Windsor to find him already seated, the parliamentary file closed beside him. He asked why Anne's objection had vanished from the official record. She replied that she had never forged a royal decree. The precision of the answer was notable. He had not asked about handwriting. He had asked who rewrote the history of that night. He opened the file and laid out Parliament's reconstructed timeline. Anne's remembered objection, the altered registry entry, the exact wording of the disputed decree. The decisive element was the access log, a technical record of who opened or changed a protected file and at what minute. He reminded her that the original complaint had not been overlooked. It had been replaced by a positive statement. The conversation that followed was conducted in low voices, yet every sentence carried the weight of institutional consequence. Camilla's defense was coherent. Her office processed documents prepared by senior staff daily. Administrative responsibility does not require personal authorship of every line issued under one's name. She had trusted experienced officials to manage procedure correctly. William listened, then sharpened the question. The issue was no longer whether she had physically altered a document. It was whether she had benefited for months from powers her husband had never clearly granted. When Diana's collection entered the discussion, Camilla reacted at once, accusing him of allowing grief to convert a records inquiry into a verdict on her place in the family. William answered without raising his voice. His mother's history mattered because one decree had altered access to objects of deep family meaning, yet he would have challenged the record even if her name had never appeared. Authority exercised without clear consent was the danger. He recalled the 2021 Dyson report into the methods used to obtain the 1995 Panorama interview. Fake documents had been employed then. The deceit had influenced what Diana said and had cost him his mother. Altered records inside his own family's system therefore carried a personal resonance no constitutional abstraction could erase. The parallel was not lost on either of them. Both understood that forged paperwork, once introduced into the machinery of trust, leaves damage that cannot be fully repaired by later correction. Parliament's access logs showed that Camilla's private authorization code had been used minutes before one of the disputed decrees was finalized. The room fell silent. She examined the entry and then acknowledged, in an account later recorded for the review, that a senior household official had been permitted to use that code while acting in her name. She maintained, and continues to maintain, that she never instructed anyone to falsify a decree. The admission did not close the matter. It expanded it. The king's authority had become reachable through a code employed by more than one person. When she reached toward the folder, William placed his hand upon it first. Father reads this before anything else disappears. He closed the file and left, understanding that the question had already moved beyond one signature or one office. The decision now rested solely with the man whose approval alone could render any of those decrees legitimate. The protective gesture of placing his hand on the folder was not theatrical. It was the practical recognition that documents of this kind had already shown a capacity to vanish or change when left unattended. Disputed royal authority cannot be preserved merely because confronting it would prove painful. Either the king approved the words, or he did not. Charles sat with the original decrees, the recovered registry timeline, and senior legal advisors while they explained the practical consequences of invalidation. Anne sat beside him without pressing. She understood that her brother was being asked to choose between protecting his wife and confirming the truth, and that pressure would only drive him further from decision. Charles read the first decree slowly. He recalled earlier conversations about collections and access, yet he did not recall approving the specific wording before him. He looked at his sister. Anne offered memory rather than comfort. She repeated what she had said on the night itself. The decree troubled her because it conferred unusually broad discretion without any requirement for further sovereign review. Charles nodded and returned to the page. The advisors remained silent while the king worked through the language himself. No one interrupted. The decision, when it came, would have to be his alone. Then he located the decisive sentence. It transferred discretion to Camilla's household office without requiring any further review by the sovereign. Once that language stood, the king need never be consulted again. He stated quietly that he would never have approved such wording. The room altered at once. This was no longer a man struggling to recover an old conversation. It was a direct rejection by the only person whose authorization could validate the document. Charles ordered all 3 disputed decrees frozen immediately and suspended every authority they had created. He understood the consequences. One of those powers had guided decisions inside his wife's office for months. Freezing it would not remain a private administrative act. He hesitated once over the pen, then signed the suspension order. Anne watched him set the pen down and recognized that her brother had chosen the institution over silence. The hesitation was brief, but those present understood its meaning. Charles was not a man who signed lightly. When he did sign, the decision was final. Camilla received the news without raised voice. The 3 decrees were suspended. Her office could exercise none of the powers they had conferred. Staff were instructed to preserve every relevant record. The detail that struck hardest was that Charles himself had signed the restriction. Alone in the office that no longer felt entirely hers, she read the notice again. Responsibility for contested decisions had returned to the king's central household administration. Nothing done under the disputed powers would now be accepted without independent verification. What cut most deeply was that he had signed without speaking to her. She had prepared for anger. She had not prepared for silence. Later that evening, Charles passed her private office. Those who observed the moment say he slowed as he reached the door. He did not enter. She remained inside. Neither crossed the few feet of carpet between them. For years, their relationship had been defined by external pressure faced together. Now, the pressure was internal, a question of what one had known and what the other could still believe. The 3 feet of carpet became a measure of the distance that had opened between them. It was not the distance of anger. It was the distance of unresolved doubt. Investigators identified a clear pattern. Each altered decree expanded authority available to Camilla's household and reduced the requirement for any second approval. Every change moved in the same direction. The same senior official named by Camilla appeared in the access logs for all 3 windows of alteration. This was not coincidence or systemic neglect. Trusted access had been used at the precise moments the records changed. William expected the evidence to drive his father further from Camilla. Instead, Charles requested a private meeting with his son. No lawyers, no advisors. Standing near the fireplace, the king admitted the dilemma that troubled him most. He no longer knew which possibility hurt more, that Camilla had known what was occurring inside her office, or that she had trusted someone who employed her authority without informing her. William's anger shifted. It remained, but it ceased to be directed at his father. Charles spoke of the humiliation of discovering that his signature had been treated as something that could be reconstructed at convenience. Sovereign approval is meant to be personal, deliberate, and unmistakable. Strip that away, and little remains beneath. The admission of that humiliation was rare. Charles did not often speak of private injury. When he did, the words carried the full weight of a lifetime spent protecting the dignity of the office he now held. William answered with care. Protecting Camilla could not mean protecting false records. Those 2 obligations had to remain separate. At the same time, he refused to condemn her for actions the investigators had not personally attributed to her. He sought accountability, not revenge. In a matter of this scale, the distinction is the difference between correction and purge. Charles then revealed that Camilla had already made a painful admission to him. She had known her office operated with unusually broad discretion. She had believed the underlying paperwork properly authorized. If accurate, the failing was one of carelessness rather than deliberate falsification. Charles set out the steps that would follow. Every disputed decree would be re-authenticated directly. The senior official linked to the access logs would lose all protected system access that same day. Camilla's delegated powers would remain suspended until fresh, verified approval was obtained. William agreed. For the first time since the records were opened, father and son were aligned on what the truth required. As William moved to leave, Charles rested a hand briefly on his arm and said that whatever happened outside, they would proceed correctly. The gesture was small, but it marked the restoration of a shared purpose that the crisis had threatened to destroy. By the following morning, the crisis belonged to the country. Newspapers carried the same central claim. Royal authority had been altered inside the machinery designed to protect it. Crowds gathered at the palace gates. Camilla listened to the coverage until a presenter asked whether Charles could ever fully trust her again, then switched off the set. Parliament confirmed that a senior household official had used credentials belonging to Camilla's office to alter all 3 records, and that no evidence showed Charles had personally approved the changes. The altered entries were formally invalidated. Charles confirmed the 3 decrees permanently void. The official responsible was dismissed and referred for investigation. Camilla retained her position beside the king, yet the extraordinary administrative powers attached to her private office were withdrawn. Independent decree processing was removed from her household entirely. Future permissions would require documented approval through the central office. Charles met her privately beforehand. He accepted that the investigation had not shown she personally altered anything. He also told her that trust carries responsibility for what is done under one's name and that she had not examined closely enough what was being done with it. She accepted the restrictions without negotiation. The consequence was not removal. It was quieter and more lasting. Confidence once given automatically would now have to be earned, document by document, for the remainder of the reign. William later received the authenticated replacement registry. The entry recording Anne's original objection had been restored in its proper place and wording. He closed the register and observed to Catherine that royal authority can survive disagreement and embarrassment. It cannot survive the manufacture of consent inside the system that is meant to protect it. At the final private family meeting, Charles placed the corrected registry on the table. Anne read her restored objection and said nothing. Camilla lowered her eyes. William closed the cover. No one celebrated. The official is gone. The 3 decrees are dead. The Queen Consort's authority has been narrowed to a fraction of what it once was. The king's approval system now rests on direct verification. The sentence Anne spoke after midnight, the one Camilla left unanswered, now sits in the permanent record of the monarchy with its date attached. The institution can endure embarrassment, division, and long-delayed truths. The moment it permits its own authority to be forged, it loses the single foundation without which a crown cannot stand. The belief that when it speaks, someone meant what was said. The weight of that belief is what had kept the monarchy intact through centuries of upheaval. It is not ceremony or tradition alone that sustains it, but the quiet assumption that the words carrying the sovereign's name are deliberate, examined, and true. When that assumption is broken from within, the damage travels further than any single decree. It reaches the people who must still decide day after day whether the institution deserves their continued confidence. William understood this as he closed the restored registry. Catherine understood it as she watched him. Anne had understood it months earlier, standing in a quiet corridor after midnight with a piece of paper that did not sound like her brother. Charles had understood it when he set the pen down after signing the suspension. And Camilla, alone in the office that no longer answered solely to her, had begun to understand the quieter price of trust that is given too freely and examined too late. The restoration of Anne's objection to the permanent record was more than a technical correction. It was the formal acknowledgement that a voice which had been deliberately erased had the right to remain. In a system built on continuity, the recovery of a suppressed truth carries its own institutional significance. What remained after the headlines faded was not triumph or vindication. It was a narrower path. Every permission that now left Camilla's desk would travel first through the central office. Every authorization would require direct confirmation. The senior official who had moved through the protected systems was gone, but the systems themselves had been rebuilt around the principle that convenience must never again outweigh verification. 3 decrees that had once guided decisions were void, their consequences reviewed and, where necessary, reversed. The public saw the correction. The family lived with its cost. In the end, the monarchy did what it has always done when forced to choose between comfort and continuity. It chose the harder course, the one that preserves the single claim without which no crown can endure. That claim is simple. When the king speaks, the words are his. When the record says otherwise, the record must be made to tell the truth. The quiet rooms at Windsor returned to their ordinary rhythms, yet nothing inside them was quite the same. Trust, once fractured, does not restore itself by decree. It is rebuilt, if at all, through the slower work of consistent verification and the refusal to allow convenience to stand in for consent. That work now belongs to the remainder of the reign.